Hello and welcome everyone to this talk on Early Modern Townhouse project for Kilkenny City. Over the next 15 minutes, we will introduce you to a project which aims to increase our knowledge of the early modern buildings in Kilkenny. The presentation will be in two parts. I will introduce the project and its aims, and Gertie Keane will take you through phase 1 of the project. Before we start, I would ask everyone to mute their computers for the duration of the talk. Also, we'll have a chance at the end to answer any questions you may have. Also, we will be recording this talk. So before we begin, I would like to introduce myself. I am Francis Cody, Architectural Conservation Officer with Kilkenny County Council. My role includes delivery of conservation grants, advice and guidance to homeowners, compilation of conservation reports on planning applications, managing the record of protected structures, and initiating projects on Kilkenny's built heritage. The photograph, so I will start the presentation now. Okay, so the photograph on the first slide is that of the Henry Shea building in High Street in Kilkenny City, circa 1580. Locals will know this building as Paris, Texas, and it was once a Woolworths on the ground floor. The photograph shows the gable remains of the early modern townhouse. However, it was removed and taken down in the 20th century due to safety concerns. So I think it is important here to detail some of the background of the project before we talk a little bit about it. So the background to the project, the Irish Historic Town Atlas of Kilkenny by John Bradley in 2000, and the 2011 Early Modern Townhouse Conference hosted by Roadhouse and Garden provide a significant backdrop to this project. Also, in recent times, the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage have discussed a new publication that they will launch this year or early next year on pre-Georgian buildings. It was at one of these recent discussions between the National Monument Service and the Built Heritage Unit of the department, between themselves and myself, that we discussed the importance of Kilkenny on the national conversation around late medieval and early modern architecture. And we discussed the knowledge gap in some of these buildings, and we wanted to address that. So part of the background and part of the objective here is to increase the knowledge base of early modern in Kilkenny. So as I said, in Kilkenny we have many buildings which are medieval and early modern in date, with a considerable amount being concealed behind Georgian and Victorian facades. Further buildings were identified by Gertie Keane, who will discuss them in the second part of this presentation, as part of our research as far back as 2010. So approximately 30 buildings, which are not included on the Urban Archaeological Survey, were identified. Increasing our knowledge around these buildings is a non-invasive approach. Is the main objective of this project. And of course, then the Heritage Council's Heritage Stewardship Fund was an important element of this project as well. The fund itself is for archaeologists conservation officers and archivists to avail of funding that can deliver projects that they would not otherwise have the time or the resources to do so. So it is great to be able to avail of such a funding stream. Okay. The objectives of the project itself. I felt that we needed to increase our knowledge around some of those early buildings that were identified in Gertie Keane's research. So in order to do that, we had to gather, collate, and create a register for that material. A number of these buildings had been reused or worked on in recent times, and to understand the building, we needed to gather the information on the building, collate all that information, and create a register and a centralised place for it all. And that was part of the premise of this project, especially the review of planning files within the Planning Authority in Kilkenny County Council. They contained a number of reports, drawings, and assessments of these buildings. Of course, then the creation of a working register centralised all that information and will be invaluable going forward. So the current situation around these buildings in the historic core of Kilkenny City can be seen here on the map. So what we have is a series of red dots that signify the sites and monuments records, which are archaeological buildings or archaeological sites within the city. The green stars are buildings that are on the record to protect the structures, and the blue dots are buildings or structures that were identified under the National Inventory of Architectural Heritage. So what we can see is there's quite a lot of protection on these buildings already. However, there's a number of buildings that were identified in recent times that we were trying to explore and try to assess to see whether they are significant buildings, and if so, try and protect those also. I'm just going to run through an early modern townhouse and the approximate time frame. Gertie Keane will take you through a more detailed assessment of this. So the approximate time frame is 1550 to 1650, and of course that is not a strict guideline. There was earlier structures in the 16th century, and of course later ones after 1650 as well that can be attributed to the early modern period. What we have here is Roadhouse, a picture of Roadhouse on the right-hand side, built by John Roth, started in 1594 and finished in 1610. Quite a nationally significant building in Kilkenny City. And we can see some of the important features on the facade of this building. We can see the chimney stacks, the octagonal chimney stacks, and in some cases we can see large chimney stacks throughout the city as well on different buildings. The characteristic hood mouldings on the windows, the oriel window, of course, then the colonnaded facade here on Roadhouse, not found in all modern, early modern buildings in Kilkenny, but quite a significant feature in its own right. And of course, then one of the fireplaces within the building are quite substantial features as well. The outcomes of the project. We're hoping for a working register on early modern townhouses in Kilkenny. So that has commenced already. We're working through to completion with that, and that's about collating and gathering all that information. And that itself will lead to a centralised information on all these buildings, something that's lacking at the minute and that we need very seriously to consider and to have as the main baseline for moving forward on these early modern townhouses. It will also increase our understanding of Kilkenny's early buildings, which is quite significant as well. Increase the public awareness is something that we try to do in Kilkenny County Council as well. And then, of course, the long-term engagement with property owners is essential. So in regards of the delivery for this phase one, the register and the collating and gathering the information is really, really significant. And then it is envisaged down the line then to engage with property owners and to increase the public awareness. So that is a quick whistle-stop tour of the project itself. Just the last slide then is my email address, where you can contact me at conservation@kilkennycoco.ie. If you have further queries, you can email me. And then I am going to hand you over to Gertie Keane, and Gertie will take you through phase one of the project. Gertie works in heritage, education and tourism sectors as an archaeologist. Okay, so I will try and just bring up Gertie's presentation here. Okay, so, okay, Gertie, over to you.
Thank you, Francis. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be involved in this project, and in many ways, it's I can actually say that it is in many ways a dream come true, because when I started my research for my master's thesis in archaeology in 2010, I had no sense of where it was going to go, but I know by the end of it, I was very much hoping that the powers that be, as it were, would look at this seriously, because I felt that there was such potential within the city to for these buildings, and that in many ways they had been forgotten about. And so to see them highlighted and looked at and examined in more detail is really what I would have loved at that time 12 years ago, and to see it happening now is, as I say, more or less a dream come true from my point of view. So I'm going to just go through some of the background to Kilkenny's early modern period, and just very generally introduce it. And then we're going to look at a few of the buildings that I suppose identified as possible early modern townhouses. And I'm really going to focus on those more so than the ones like, dare I say, Roadhouse, which is a known early modern townhouse, and the Henry Shea house, of course, is too. Now that they will come into the conversation a little bit, but as I said, the real emphasis from my point of view for this particular project and at this point in time, this presentation is really to, I suppose, highlight those that are not recorded or were maybe unknown. So starting off with my first slide. So basically, as I say, the basis for this project was, to some extent, some of my research in 2010 entitled Great Stone Houses, Kilkenny and its Early Modern Townhouses, 1550 to 1650. And I'll very quickly just look at some of my research questions at that time. And I'm not going to dwell on them usually, but really just to give you a background, an introduction to where this, I suppose, started from. So that was the title of the project or of the research, and I'm just moving on very quickly, as I say, to the research questions. In 2010, these were the questions I had and which I answered, I hope, within my thesis. So what I was looking at was the townhouses. What were the plan in other words, how were they positioned in relation to their various plots? What kind of plan did they take? What kind of form did they take? Were they all the same? So the relationship, for example, between the townhouse plans and the burghers plots, and as I say, their architectural form. So the number of townhouses still upstanding, of course, was very important. The preservation and survival levels, because I remember at the time, for example, taking a walk down High Street and into was Irish Town essentially, and really, apart from Roadhouse, there was no set, and maybe the Butterslip, which was part of the Langton house, there was no sense of early modern Kilkenny. And I thought, does it even exist initially? And it was only as I dig deeper and delved in the backlands, as it were, behind the houses and in down laneways and into cellars, and it slowly started to reveal itself, and it became very, very exciting then at that point. So these were the questions, as I say, that slowly started to be answered in some cases, and like all research, you very often end up with more questions than are at the end of the research that are still to be answered, and that's part of where we're at now, I suppose. So anyway, number of townhouses still upstanding, and as Francis mentioned in his introduction, a lot of these townhouses exist, and we'll see this in my slides, but they aren't what they appear, let's say, at an initial glance. And so the next one then, of course, was the preservation level and the survival levels. Yet some of the answers to these questions are still to be fully answered, because it involves more architectural survey and archaeological survey to some extent as well. Not necessarily invasive to any huge extent, but certainly a certain level of it. Now, the townhouses and the prevailing changing concepts in social ordering. So you might ask, what was that about? In the late 1500s, we were just really, I suppose Europe in general had seen the Renaissance unfolding, and we were in Ireland. We were obviously in a very different place to some extent. But as we move on, things were changing. People's thought patterns were changing for many reasons, and how they lived was beginning to change. And it was a time of overall change in ideas, in architecture, and just as the Renaissance brought in a lot of these changes, and to some extent in Ireland, not so much so as maybe in other parts of Europe. So that was one of the questions that I hopefully addressed in my thesis as well. And of course, the location and positioning of the townhouses. So in other words, where were some of the townhouses, particularly the larger ones, and then some of the smaller ones as well, of course, and where the location in general, but also in relative to one another and to some of the key buildings within Kilkenny, such as the Thalsel, for example, in the Market Square. So, as I said, that's just to give a general background on my research. So moving on from that, then the next one then is changes over time. I want to look at this very briefly and how Kilkenny, as it were, for those of you that are local, you will know, of course, the history to some extent of Kilkenny has been an Anglo-Norman town, and that's reflected very much in the next slide, which is a little map by Bradley in 1975 of the High Town of Kilkenny. So on the southern side, you can see the castle, and of course then on the northern side or end of the town, that would be St. Canice's Cathedral, and right in the middle, of course, then you have St. Mary's Church, which and the Market Square was off the high street, as it were, which runs as a central axis from south to north between the castle and the cathedral. And of course, the various gates into the city. Then you have obviously the St. Patrick's Gate coming from the south, and of course the Walkin's Gate then, and St. James's Gate along the western side of the city. And of course in the north then you had at the gate into Irish town and so forth. So and the various abbeys and friaries that existed right up to the medieval period. Moving on from that then, background history. Kilkenny, as I say, Kilkenny and Ireland in general within the 16th century was a very huge social and political turmoil in the Tudor conquest of Ireland. We had obviously Henry VIII, and then of course Queen Elizabeth. She really was determined to solve the issue that she, as it were, inherited from Henry VIII's time, and ultimately bring a complete conquest to Ireland at that point in time in her reign. And Kilkenny at that time, that said, this is the period that we're looking at. This is the period between 1550, when Queen Elizabeth was on the throne, right up to 1650, where she died in the early 1600s. But needless to say, in that last 50 years of the 16th century, Kilkenny started to change quite dramatically. It had been that little medieval town that I showed you within the previous slide, and then it started to change. And why did but it was also protected from what was happening, the social and political turmoil and warfare to a large extent that was happening elsewhere in Ireland. For example, you had the various rebellions throughout Ireland, in Munster and various places, but Kilkenny was largely protected. And the reason for that was it was at that point the 10th Earl of Ormond had the power in Kilkenny Castle, his main seat being in Kilkenny Castle, but he was also very closely linked to the court in England, and of course he was related to Queen Elizabeth I of England, as well as being a cousin of Queen Elizabeth. So he had the ear of the Queen, as it were, and he was able to give that protection to Kilkenny and the surrounding areas. And it meant that Kilkenny in this period started to change, as I say, but change, as it were, not just as from a medieval town, but to be transformed into a city, kind of an early modern city. And this is when we see these houses started to be built in that early modern period from the late 16th century onwards. And it was under the patronage and the, as it were, privilege of Thomas Butler, or Black Tom as he was known, that this began to happen. And it happened with the merchant families. These were an oligarchy of families, and many of the local people listen to this now will understand what we're talking about here. We have names like Shea, Roth, Archer, of course, Roadhouse being one of those that came from this period, and then Archer and Langton, and there were many others as well. And these were all families that had been in Kilkenny as it were Old English for centuries. But as the 16th century dawned, they became more and more powerful and more wealthy, and had inherited a lot, or were granted a lot of the lands in the post-Reformation period, and increased their wealth. And they had huge power. A lot of them worked as agents for the Earls of Ormond over the decades, and particularly as we move into this latter 50 years of the 16th century and into the 17th century. So as a result of that dominance of these families, and also their power and their wealth and prestige, and a lot of this also, because they were merchants, they travelled widely. They travelled throughout Europe into England. The River Nore was their navigation route down into the south of England, or south of Ireland, and into New Ross and across to Bristol. And they were open to the ideas that I spoke about earlier of the Renaissance and changing architecture, culture. They were importing all of the wealth of Europe into Kilkenny and selling it on from there. So they were at the coalface of change, as it were, not just in terms of what was happening in Europe, as I say, but in Kilkenny as well. And they were at the forefront, as I say, of it. So they had those cultural, political and economical links that enabled them to do all of those things. And that then becomes reflected in the architecture of these houses. So moving on from that, we'll start to maybe have a little look at some of the houses. And I think, but first, I think I just thought this would be kind of a little interesting little exercise, just to look at Kilkenny in that transition period from a medieval town, where a lot of the architecture up this point, apart from the castle and the cathedral, was very much thatched houses, wattle and daub structures, and very much prone to fire and destruction. And the part of my thesis, when I looked at it way back in 2010, I felt that the power that these people held enabled them to make decisions and as we're calling the shots in some ways, and decide, okay, we can change this. We can build Kilkenny into a city. We can maybe look to see, can we get a royal charter, which was granted, as we know, in 1609. So I reckoned in my research that it took them about 30 to 40 years from the time they started to build Kilkenny as well, and transform it in the initial stages until they got their royal charter. So, and I think this is reflected in some of these dates. So we don't have all the dates, but we have some of the dates, and that is because we have the armorial plaques on some of these houses, or they did exist. Unfortunately, a lot of them have been lost. But even in the ones we have, you can see the timeline, as it were. So, for example, around 1580, we have the modernisation of Kilkenny Castle. So the Black Tom, he built a great gallery in Kilkenny Castle in the early modern style. Now, remembering that he also built his country mansion, as it were, i.e. Ormond Castle in Carrick-on-Suir, just in 1565. So he again was influenced by what was happening in Tudor England, obviously, as it being very much aligned with what was happening at the court of Queen Elizabeth, and was reared in that court he was actually brought up with King Edward the Sixth, I think he was, and Jane Seymour's son with Henry VIII, and so he had huge influence there, and he saw what was the changes in architecture over there, and he wanted a little bit of the same over here. So Ormond Castle was his little country retreat, as it were, in Carrigan-Shure, and he built that in 1565. So by 1580, then he started making changes to Kilkenny Castle, and then in 1582 we see the Tolsel was moved to its present location. And 1580 again, we see these dates are so similar, and you see the Henry Shea townhouse that Francis referred to. And if you look at the slide itself, the top little photograph that I've just put in along the top of the slide, this is the present Tolsel, of course, which dates from the 18th century. But this next one then is the Henry Shea townhouse, and that's taken from a photograph of the 19th century. The next one then, of course, is Martin Archer townhouse, and that was built in 1582, just 2 years after Henry Shea. He had the Shea Almshouse here on the small photograph, which was built again by the Shea family in Sir Richard Shea in this case, but in 1582 again, and then Elias Shea. So you can see the dominance of this one family even within these buildings. Again, you have 1582 coming up, and of course we have a gap then up to the 1600s, and that's not because nothing happened, but because we were missing dates on buildings, on certain buildings. So the Bull Inn, which I don't have a photograph of here now, but it was a building that exists in part or survives in part at the very bottom of Irish Town, and that was built in 1602, and it was a very much similar style with a single gable building facing onto the street, as you see the Shea Almshouse. Then the next one, then we have the Nicholas Langton townhouse, which we see in part here in the lower photograph with the arch, just I think it's second from the bottom or thereabouts. And last but not least, then you have, of course, Roadhouse, built between 1694 and 1610. By 1650, the civil survey of 1650 recorded about 148 of these stone wall and slate roofed houses. Now, this was out of a total housing stock in Kilkenny at the time in 1650 of approximately 300. So approximately half of them at this point in time had become stone walled and slate roofed townhouses. So quite a considerable percentage there. Okay, moving on swiftly because I'm conscious of time here. I just want to quickly look at a few little maps here. We have then the down survey depiction of Kilkenny in 1655, and that gives you a sense of the city at that point. Now it's kind of a it's a kind of schematic type drawing. It's not to scale, obviously, but again, it gives you a sense of the houses. You can see them up along the High Street and right up to the cathedral in the north end and the castle in the south end here. So again, so moving on to the next slide, then we have a later Roke survey of the city of Kilkenny in the mid 18th century, and you can see the High Street very, very clearly set out, and also all the burgage plots beautifully filled in with their various all the gardens and the various niceties as were of the time, and all functioning buildings and functioning gardens and of the time. So the next slide, then I'm going to draw to your attention. Francis looked at this in brief. This is the slide that shows that Henry Shea house, and I'm not going to dwell, as I say, on the larger and more known townhouse, but I love this photograph of it because it dates from the 19th century and by William Hartford, and you can see it in all its glory. It really is was a beautiful building, and it's such a shame, that it didn't survive. And the thing about the Henry Shea townhouse that I find very significant is its location, because it's located at the very end of what was Walkin's street from Walkin's Gate, and I suggested at the time that maybe that became the formal avenue to the townhouse, because it provided that focal point at the end of that street, which was quite straight and from what we can gather from the gate, and it was such a, as I say, the huge sense of and dominance of it at the end of the street would have been quite a wow factor for anybody arriving into the city. And of course, one thing to remember about these larger townhouses in particular is that what we see on the street is only one portion of them. They extended right back across the Burgers Plots in many cases, and that is seen even today. Now, if you were to visit Roadhouse, you'll see there's not just one house, but there's actually 3 houses with intervening courtyards. Now, moving on, again, I'm not going to dwell on these. I created various maps at the time, which were again done with Global Information System, as we call it, or GIS, and they're sort of plotted so that I suppose I kind of categorize the various townhouses, and I'm not going to take the time today now to go into them because we just don't have it. But basically, I looked at we broke them down into known townhouses, possible townhouses, ones that were recorded in various ways and whatever. So at that time, there were 12 certain early modern townhouses that were known early modern townhouses and recorded as such. And I identified 20 or so possible early modern that may have early modern townhouse origin, but they may also be more. And these needed further investigation. And that's where we're at this point. Okay, so as I say, moving on swiftly. Okay, Francis again kind of touched on this, so we're going to create this live register, which focused on, as I say, approximately 20 to 30 townhouses in High Street, Parliament Street, Ferry Street, St. Kieran's Street, Patrick Street, Rose Inn Street, and of course, collating all the information, as Francis mentioned, from the various records. So you have the RPS, the NIAH, the SMR, and the planning files, of course, and reports. And it's great to see that this happening, as I say, and to know that all of this information is going to be now worked on as a one whole body and added to over time. So the houses themselves. Okay, as I say, I said at the start that I was going to focus on the houses that more so that are not known of, and that need attention. So the first one I'm going to look at here is number 10 and 11 High Street. Now, I spoke about Walcott Street, which of course is now Friary Street. And Friary Street, on either side, as I say, at the top of it, we have the Henry Shea townhouse facing on to High Street. And but either side of it, flanking it, as it were, at the very, as it borders High Street, we have this particular set of houses. And I look at another one then subsequently in the next slide that flanks on the, what would be the north. This is on the southern flanking on the southern side, as it were, of Friary Street. So we have what's the book centre and the Woolen Mill Hall. I think it's still the case that these buildings are in the same, but the one on the right, which is number 11. No, that's the one right on the corner, as it were, of Friary Street and High Street. That is recorded and is regarded as an early modern townhouse. The one on the left is not. And the likelihood is this was all one building at one point. It was an early modern townhouse in total, in one building, one house, in other words. And as a result, if that is the case, and that's where we need to further investigation, that number 10 needs to be recorded as such, right? So these are the kind of things we're looking at. And again, really important, if it is the case that it is a total, even two properties now, that it is one early modern townhouse, then it's a very significant building as such. Moving on, similarly, this is the one on the northern flank, as it were, of High Street and Friary Street, and this is known locally as Paul's, or one section of Paul's. Now, lovely image on the right hand side. You can see it from graves of the 19th century. You can see the Henry Shea townhouse again, And on the left, you see the building, which with the ladder, as it were, it seems to be a ladder. I'm not sure, but it looks like a ladder, just as it were, thrown up against it. And that is Paul's, as it was in the 19th century. And you can see it's a magnificent early modern townhouse with a lot of the features that Francis pointed out earlier. And if you look at it, we can't see the full extent of the front of it, but it is at least 3, if not 4 bays wide. And it is 1, 2, 3, 4 stories high, at least, more likely above basement, so 5 stories in total. And if you look at the building as it exists pretty much today, it hasn't hugely changed in many ways. You can still see the overall form of the building, but what is missing is that, again, we're only looking at one section of it. And that is the section that is not, the number 13, which is next door, is not recorded. And again, that needs to be addressed as and put together. So basically the 2 properties in terms of being registered need to be registered as an early modern townhouse in total. And maybe further investigation will determine that. So that is a really interesting one and a key one in a very key site, as it were. This one, next property that I'm going to show you, for me, is really exciting, I think. And it's, again, one that has kind of slipped under the radar in many ways, I feel. It is not known, it's not recorded, and it's unfortunately not protected to any huge extent. And I feel it is an early modern townhouse. It has all of the form of it, a very high pitched roof, which is very much a feature of the early modern townhouses. And now we don't know, obviously, because it has modern interventions at the ground floor level and shop fronts, whether there was a colonnaded arch there. It may not have been the case, but we, again, further investigation would enable us to find out things like this. If the central doorway that we see, modern doorway, could possibly have been a central slipway, we don't know. We know that exists in the Archer house, that there's a central slip there, and you can actually see some of the features if you walk into it. And this may have been one of that's just been basically covered over and modernized. And of course, it's very much, if you look at it, a Georgian building. To look at it from all appearances from the front, but if you look at it from the back, it's quite interesting. It's a long plot, very similar in length to Roadhouse. It hasn't really, at the time, I couldn't get access to it. I was literally able to see it over a high wall. But what I could see, it had very little interventions over the decades, unlike, unfortunately, some other houses. And it seemed to be very much a plot that was virgin territory and would be very interesting to investigate. But what was interesting, if you notice, there is a rear return on the original building. And if you note the window on the gable of that, it does appear to have been an altered early modern window. And there's a building then that abuts that, and that would be a later building, but again, an interesting addition. It does seem to hold some antiquity, that particular brick building there as well. And so this building certainly needs investigation. And it would be very, very exciting because it's number 30. It's in a key location, again, right on the high street. And it would be very exciting to see that as it were revealed as such. Now, moving on, Parliament Street. These are 3 buildings now in present times. But I did speak to the owner in the case of one of these buildings, and he was able to tell me that this was possible. He knew these 3 buildings to be one great early modern townhouse at one point, and he knew the story and the history behind them. And he was able to tell me that there was a tannery, which of course in the early modern period was would have been quite a common thing to find in behind. There was a tannery in one of the buildings behind it, and because these buildings, as I say, were merchant houses, they obviously provided living quarters, but they also were working buildings. They were places of trade. And so to find a tannery or a bakehouse or whatever it may be in the back would have been acceptable, and it would be a really interesting thing. So these buildings, again, while they appear very much in the maybe Georgian stroke Victorian style, again, need further investigation. We move on to Parliament Street on the the eastern side of Parliament Street. So basically crossing the street from the previous set of buildings. And we have, again, what appear to be very much, you can see the street as the photograph taken up in the corner of the slide looks, as it were, this upwards facing south, as it were, and you can see the building that I'm, as it were, focusing in on. It was about 3 buildings up from the building with the ivy on it, and they all appear to be very much Georgian buildings. But if you look a little bit more closely, for example, what's happening in the cellar here, we have this, you know, the window again. It doesn't appear to be Georgian. The chimney stacks seem to have been altered as well over time. You can see where they have been topped off with brick, but they really are stone. So again, questions need to be asked. What's happening with this house? And again, we'll see as we move up along St. Parliament Street, it gets even more interesting because for anybody that lives in Kilkenny would be possibly familiar with some of these buildings. This next one is again very much in the Victorian and Georgian style, and you can see, for example, you have what appears to be absolute Georgian splendor with these wonderful brick-faced Georgian buildings, and the Italian restaurant, as it's called, the building with that's painted in this kind of rusted shade. But yet, when we take a trip down into the basement area, it's a very different story. We have mullioned windows, we have door surrounds and also fireplaces that are very much in the early modern period. So again, really, really interesting to see. And there is probably more. I didn't get access to the whole building. I just happened to be, dare I say, visiting the building and a meeting, and discovered that these existed. You know, sometimes these buildings are not commercial buildings being used commercially, and it's not always possible to get to get access, or it wasn't for me anyway at the time when I was doing my field research to all areas, as it were, of the building. But even to find these finds was really fantastic, and it gives us a sense of what is still to be found, as it were. And again, some of these are recorded, some of them are not in total. Now, as we move up along these Georgian buildings, if you were to walk south, as it were, up along the street, leaving the buildings with the buildings on your left, and take a little tour down what is known as Barrack Lane, I think it is it? Yeah, and a little walk down at the back of the buildings and look at what we find. We find all of this early modern architecture. So you have mullioned windows, you have hood mouldings, you have arched doorways, and very much not a brick building, but very much a stone structure. And you have beautiful rainwater goods still surviving there. You can see the spout of the rain at the roof level, that just in this slide here, I've honed in on it. You can see it here at a distance. Obviously, you have more modern interventions here in terms of extensions, etc. But all of this, and this is at the back of that Italian restaurant, I think, it's that particular building. As far as I'm aware, that's the back of it. And that is all there as we speak today. So it is. So very much Georgian to the front, but only in face only, as it were. Very much the fabric of the building is early modern, and the rest of the building to the rear is early modern as well. The next one again brings us down as far as those of you that again were familiar with Parliament Street. This is more or less opposite now. We're at pretty much on the other side of the street to Roadhouse. You have St. Francis Brewery just sneaking into that photograph here. And if you take a walk down this archway, and you can see again that questions, you can see the building itself looks very much, brick facade, very much of the later periods. But actually, when you start to look at it, you can see the brickwork here is not part of the original structure. The structure itself is stone, and the brickwork, as it were, has been added in later in kind of almost in a crude way, kind of knitted into the building, not in the part of the original structure. And so again, a lot of questions around all of this area of Parliament Street in terms of the fabric. Now I'm going to move on swiftly again to Patrick Street in this instance, and this is number 5 and 6 Patrick Street. So again, very much, you know, a later style of a building, you think, but actually when you look at it again more closely, you see things that don't quite fit. We have an early modern chimney stack, an octagonal chimney stack. And now it could be in some cases that these are reused, but not as likely in the case of a chimney stack. And also in the basement area, you begin to see things that don't quite fit as well. So again, more investigation required. Now, one of the things that the civil survey highlights, I suppose, is, as I say, there was 145 of these great stone houses built, but the largest proportion of them was of moderate size townhouses. So this was one of the things that I obviously looked at in my research, and some of these I just want to just basically, some of them are recorded, some of them are not, but again, you know, some of them have been overlooked in time. And so, for example, what kind of form did these moderate townhouses take? And that was one of the questions I was trying to address. And I'm not sure I completely answered it, but certainly I tried to do so. But there's some interesting structures that aren't of the same scale, let's say, as the like of the Henry Shea townhouse. So, for example, you have this building here, which fronts, you can just about see what is this building right beside it, known as locally as Uncle Sam's. And that is a Georgian, was recognised as a Georgian plebe house of the 18th century, but it's actually is 5 bays wide because 2 of the bays are in behind this other building. So why, the question is, why was this building built in front? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Did this house come first? But certainly this building is recorded as having early modern fabric within it. And you can actually walk in, it's a cafe, or at least you could at the time, and you could actually see some of that early modern fabric within the cafe as well, some of the lovely, beautiful oak beams, etc. So again, a lot of questions being asked around the glebe house itself, because archaeological investigations to the rear of the house showed some early modern discoveries. So again, an investigation, and also the fact that it's set back against this building, or behind this building, I should say. Again, in this one here, which is a very small little box-like structure, again, and remember, a lot of these facades have been changed, so they may not have taken this form in the original, in its original state. But this one here is also has early modern windows at the back of the building, whereas again in the front it's been totally altered. Again, we have in the cellar of this building, we have what maybe even medieval fabric. And that is something that we're conscious of, that some of these buildings, particularly maybe along the eastern side of High Street, may have medieval fabric within them. So this building again is another one that has been, I suppose, just recorded as being again of a later date, but again warrants further investigation. This is Flowers by Lucy, known locally as Flowers by Lucy, and again you can see the similarity in style to the Shea Alms house, that single gabled building facing onto the street. Again, you know, needs more further investigation. These 2 little houses here, I think they're known as the Yard in St. Kieran Street. They've been now become, when I did my thesis, they were semi-derelict and closed up, but I'm glad to see that they have actually been taken over. And but this one on the end here, at the very end, it's just opposite the Kittler's Inn. The gable of it faces onto Kittler's Inn, has an early modern window in the gable. So it poses the question, where does this one sit? Because that's not recorded as well. And again, warrants a little bit further investigation there. Now, I've put in the Shea Alms house, which isn't strictly an early modern townhouse, but what is really notable, as I say, about it is because of its form. But what I suspected at the time was this building wasn't quite as innocent looking in terms of its facade as as it seemed. And I have since seen a photograph, which unfortunately I wasn't able to get a copy of it, which showed that it possibly was originally part of the Shea Almshouse and and so that the Shea Almshouse wasn't a single gable building, but in fact was a double gable building. And this was that particular section of the building originally. So if I could get that copy of it, of that photograph, it would be really, really interesting. If anybody knows or has a copy of it, I would be really, really interested, or pass it on to Francis. It would be really fantastic, because it really would be, you know, fantastic to see that the original form, as it were, of the Shea Almshouse in total. Okay, so as I say, that gives you a real sense of. Okay, some of our slides now I think have just, we have a bit of a technical thing here. Slides missing here now, I think. Oh yeah, sorry, no, yeah, they're gone. We've lost slides here for some reason. Okay. Right, there was 2 or 3 slides up for some reason that have not transferred across, but and it's unfortunate because this was a view of what was Kerwin's Lane in Galway, and Kerwin's Lane in Galway, it's an only shame now this hasn't come through, but basically it was, if you can cast your mind back to the previous slide where I showed you the derelict buildings or remains of the early modern original early modern buildings on Parliament Street, in other words, the back of the Italian restaurant, where we looked at the various features, and the extent of dereliction there pretty much reflects what was found on Kerwin's Lane in Galway. And that was in the noughties, in the Celtic Tiger period, thankfully revealed. It wasn't, and part of it again was concealed behind a modern facade, and it wasn't altogether clear the extent of what was there. And the photograph, which is unfortunately it hasn't come through, shows the before and after essentially. So anybody that's Galway, you possibly are familiar with it. Anybody who hasn't been to Galway, maybe if you're going to Galway, take a look at, go to Kerwin's Lane, have a look at it, and it just shows that what can be done with these situations. That you know, you have what appears to be something that's beyond rescue, but with modern conservation and preservation techniques and interventions, they can be brought back to life, as it were, and restored sympathetically in an appropriate fashion using best conservation and methodologies and techniques, and they can be part of a community once again, and become they can add vitality and vibrance and you know, basically add to the quality of life to a particular area of the city or a particular street that maybe have fallen into dereliction. And it's not even just that; it's just also the heritage value. For so many reasons, to the people of in this instance of Galway, but to Ireland in general, because these are buildings that are of their time. They cannot be repeated. They're never going to be early modern buildings, as it were. We can't build an early modern building today in the same style, but we can certainly restore what's there and preserve what is there. And so maybe down the line, I would love to see some of the buildings that have been identified, and we've only just touched on some of them now today, very quickly. That if you have time to go back over some of them yourself and maybe have a look at it in more detail, then take the time and think about it, because they are part of, particularly people of Kilkenny, they are part of your heritage, and they're certainly part of our Irish heritage, and they need to be valued, acknowledged, and appreciated for future generations, and not just for ourselves. So thank you very much.
That's great, Gertie.
Right.
Thank you very much for that.
A little bit over, sorry.
So that's great. Gertie's given us a really good detailed assessment of early modern townhouses in Kilkenny, and identified a number of other properties that we're hoping to do a little bit of work on as part of this project. So it was amazing to see the evolution of the town to be a city, and the buildings were obviously integral in that process as well. So thank you very much for that, Gertie. In regards to Kieran's Lane and some of the slides towards the end, we'll put this up on the website, and we will add those slides to it. I'm not sure why they were left off, but we can do that. There's absolutely no problem there at all. So these will be accessible on the conservation page of the planning section of the Kilkenny County Council website. So if we don't have any questions, what we will do is we will end the talk now. So we'll give an opportunity for anyone to put a question in the chat box or to raise their hand, and then we can answer that. So if any questions at all. Okay, so we have no questions coming in. So what we'll do is we'll put this recording up on the website, and then we'll put the presentations up on the website as well. So conservation@kilkennycoco.ie is my email address, and you can contact me directly, or if you have any questions for Gertie down the line as well. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.